We are about to start. If you could take your seats after the exciting conversations of the refreshments. Let me start by saying, dear Chair of S20 2025, Professor Thokozani Majozi, representing the Academy of Science of South Africa, Professor Helena Nader and Mr. Marcus Schoenstuhl, representing the Brazilian Academy of Science, Academia Brasileira de Ciência, and hosts of the 2024 Science20 meeting in Brazil. Thank you. Dr. Lauren Augustine and Dr. Vaughan Turikian, representing the National Academy of Sciences, USA, hosts of the 2026 Science 2020 meeting. Thank you. Representatives from the academies within the G20 countries. Welcome. International, regional and local partners, ASSAf Council members and other ASSAf members, that is, the Academy of Science of South Africa, distinguished guests, the organising committee, thank you too, media representatives, and the Secretariat of the Academy of Sciences of South Africa. Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Gledhill, and it is an honour to serve as your Programme Director this morning. I'm a member of Council of the Academy of Science of South Africa, and I have the honour of chairing this session. So welcome to a space in which we have common interests, in which the integrity of the scientific method prevails. This is a meeting for deep thinking, for realistic discussion, and I believe we can develop reason for hope. Instead of giving long biographies, because I know the effect of long biographies after a long-haul flight, I will give the briefest of introductions to each speaker. So it is a pleasure to introduce the President of the Academy of Science of South Africa, Professor Thokozani Majozi, who is Executive Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and the Built Environment, and a Professor in the School of Chemical and Metallurgical Engineering at the University of the Witwatersrand here in South Africa, with long experience both in industry and in academia. He's the former chairperson of the board of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, was awarded the National Order of Mapungubwe by the President of South Africa for his contribution to industrial wastewater minimization, among many other medals and awards, both national and international. Professor Majozi.
Thank you very much, Eagle, for that introduction. I think you've done very well in recognizing protocol, but I think I would have to recognize a few colleagues as well, just before I get going. Prof. Helena Nader, who is here, and Mr. Marcus Schoenstuhl from the Brazilian Academy of Science, who were the hosts for the 2024 Science20, just to really express our sincere gratitude for how well that was handled and the role you played in assisting us to prepare for this particular meeting. I want to recognize Dr. Lauren Augustine and Dr. Vaughan Turikian, who are representing the National Academy of Sciences of the United States. Those will be the hosts for our 2026 Science20. All the representatives, colleagues from the G20 countries, international, regional, and local partners. We also have in attendance here a number of council members for ASSAf, as well as ASSAf members, just the ASSAf members who are here. I want to recognize you, colleagues, distinguished guests, all the representatives from the media houses, the organizers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. For me in particular, it is profound, this is my profound honor and privilege that I welcome you all to Pretoria in particular for the 2025 Science20 meeting hosted by the Academy of Science of South Africa. I just hope that you had a restful evening after that warm welcome yesterday or last night. I also sensed a lot of collegiality that characterized our welcome reception last evening. I hope that this is really a marker for what lies ahead for this meeting. Your presence from across the globe is a testament to our shared commitment to addressing the world's most pressing challenges through scientific cooperation and evidence-based solutions. I did mention yesterday in the welcoming address that this marks a historic moment for us. It is the first time the G20 is being hosted on the African continent. And this significance is amplified by the recent admission of the African Union as a full member of G20, bringing the voice of more than 1.4 billion Africans to this important global forum. Our meeting today symbolizes the culmination of the current cycle of S20 meetings and sets the stage for transition to United States presidency next year, following South Africa's presidency this year and Brazil's, of course, last year. Our President, President Cyril Ramaphosa, eloquently reminded us during the first meeting of G20 foreign ministers that just as cooperation supported the progress of early humans, our modern-day challenges can only be resolved through collaboration, partnership, and solidarity. Close quote. Indeed, the G20 itself was established to foster such cooperation in addressing global challenges. Within this framework, the Science20 serves as the intellectual cornerstone where evidence meets policy, where research informs action, and where scientific consensus shapes our collective future. The academies represented here today embody the highest standards of scientific inquiry and integrity that our respective nations have to offer. Our theme, which was carefully selected, climate change and well-being, could not be more timely and consequential. This intersection represents perhaps the greatest challenge of our time, one that transcends borders, one that transcends economies and political systems. The evidence is unequivocal. Our climate is changing at an unprecedented rate, primarily due to human activities, our activities. The latest scientific data shows that global temperatures continue to rise. Extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and intensity, and ecosystems worldwide are under severe stress. The impacts of these changes on human well-being are profound and far-reaching. In Africa, we are witnessing these impacts firsthand. The prolonged droughts threatening food security across the continent, the rising sea levels endangering coastal communities, increased prevalence of climate-sensitive diseases, climate-induced migration and its societal implications, and lastly, water scarcity affecting millions of people. Yet these challenges are not unique to Africa. From devastating wildfires in the Americas and Australia to catastrophic flooding in Europe and Asia, no region is immune to this. No one is spared. So climate change does not recognize national boundaries, making international scientific cooperation not just beneficial, but essential. The South Africa's G20 presidency is centered around three foundational themes that also guide our scientific deliberations here. One is solidarity, the other one is equality, and ultimately sustainable development. Solidarity in scientific endeavors means sharing knowledge, data, and technological innovations without unnecessary barriers. It means recognizing that the climate crisis requires collective action informed by the best available science from all corners of the globe. Equality demands that we acknowledge the disproportionate impacts of climate change on vulnerable populations and developing nations. It requires us to consider issues of climate justice and ensure that solutions don't exacerbate existing inequalities, but rather serve as vehicles for greater equity. Sustainable development, on the other hand, reminds us that our solutions must balance environmental protection with human advancement. We must find pathways that allow for economic progress while preserving our planet's life-supporting systems for future generations. As national science academies, we occupy a unique position at the interface of research, policy, and society. We are not merely repositories of knowledge, but active participants in shaping how that knowledge is applied to real-world challenges. In the context of climate change and well-being, our responsibilities are manifold, but I'll summarize them as follows. We must continue to advance the scientific understanding of climate systems and their interactions with human health and welfare. We must communicate complex scientific findings in accessible ways that inform both policymakers and the public. We must foster interdisciplinary approaches that bridge the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. We must nurture the next generation of scientists equipped to tackle these multifaceted challenges. And lastly, we must ensure that indigenous and local knowledge systems are integrated with conventional scientific approaches. The discussion document we have shared outlines several key areas that will be explored over the next 2 days. That is the discussion document that was mentioned early on in our early conversation. That document includes climate adaptation strategies and their implications for public health, the nexus between climate change, biodiversity loss, and human well-being, energy transitions that address both climate mitigation and social equity, innovative technologies and practices for climate resilience, knowledge systems that integrate diverse perspectives on climate and well-being. So our distinguished speakers will present on these topics, providing a foundation for our collective deliberations. That document is meant to spark or ignite deliberations. It is not cast in stone. But the true value of this meeting lies in the discussions that will follow, in your insights, in your questions, in your commitment to finding common ground. The outcome of our work here will be crystallized into the communiqué to be published later this year, as we discussed early on. And this document is not merely a summary of our proceedings, but it presents concrete recommendations to G20. That is now the communiqué that we're going to be working on. So those recommendations ought to be grounded in scientific evidence and the collective wisdom of the academies represented here today. Colleagues, and in conclusion, the challenges before us are immense, but so too are the opportunities through scientific cooperation, innovation, and steadfast commitment that lies among us. We have the ability to integrate all these together and come up with meaningful solutions for a sustainable future. As we begin these important discussions, let us remember that the science we advance is not an end in itself, but a means to improve the well-being of all people and the planet we share. Let us approach our work with urgency, but also with hope, knowing that together we have the knowledge and capability to make a difference. I encourage each of you to please engage freely and constructively in the sessions ahead. Share your expertise, challenge assumptions, build upon each other's ideas, and above all, keep sight of our common purpose, which is to harness the power of science in service of humanity and our shared home, this planet. It is all we have. With that, I declare the 2025 Science20 meeting officially open. Thank you, colleagues, and I look forward to our productive discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Majosi. So now I have a short announcement. You will notice that in your program there is a loose page, and it does contain corrections to the program for which we profoundly apologize. But should you have found that your particular country had been missing and that it was G17, not G20, we do apologize for that. We now have a message from the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation of South Africa supporting this meeting today. And it turns out that the messenger is in fact the minister. So is it possible for us to roll the recorded message from Minister Emmanuel Blade Nzimande to this meeting?
Let me take this opportunity on behalf of South Africa, the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation, and myself to welcome all delegates to this important gathering of S20, which is part of the G20 and the build-up to the summit towards the end of the year. I would particularly like to welcome those delegates who are visiting South Africa for the first time and say to them, please do find some time to explore our country as well and be a tourist. This is a historic gathering because it's part of the G20 presidency that South Africa is holding this year. And it is the first G20 gathering that is being held in the African continent. Our approach as South Africa is that much as it is being held in South Africa, but we regard this very much as being hosted by the continent as a whole. We are holding this G20 against the background of our own priorities in South Africa in the area of science, technology, and innovation, which we are sharing with you just as the backdrop against understanding what we are doing as a country. We've got 6 priorities. The first is pandemic preparedness, given the reality that pandemics are going to be part of our future. The second priority is emerging technologies, in particular artificial intelligence, which is going to play a very important role in our lives and societies. The third priority is high-end skills, like PhD programs. And this is a particular focus area for developing countries who still need to produce as many PhDs as possible as part of our high-end skills. The fourth is mobilization of funding, which is a priority also in our science, technology, and innovation area. And the fifth one is strengthening and ensuring that we focus on African relations. And lastly, we are holding this against the background of the African Union heads of state having adopted the Science, Technology, Innovation Strategy for Africa, STISA 2034. Our expectations from your gathering is, of course, that you must focus on science-based solutions to the many problems that face us, some of which I have actually outlined as part of the priorities for South Africa. We expect no less from yourselves in particular, insofar as producing solutions to the problems we face. I would also like to say that it's very important that you also lay a very strong foundation for collaboration and partnerships that will last beyond this South African G20 presidency. From new relationships, institutional collaboration, research partnerships, and even some think tanking capacity that we may want to build around these important themes under which South Africa is holding the G20. For instance, solidarity and equality, and to promote the development of the whole world, and in particular the developing countries. With these words then, I want to wish you all the best and to say that we are particularly looking forward to the outcomes of your discussions. I will indeed be convening a ministerial meeting in September in South Africa, and I have no doubt that some of the matters that you will discuss, including your recommendations and approaches, will also find the way into the G20 ministerial meeting of the research track. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the Ministry and to Minister Blade and Zimande. We now move to the thoughts of the Troika, which are going to be short, I imagine. And I'm going to invite, first of all, Professor Helen Nader and Mr. Marcos Schoenstuhl from the Brazilian Academy of Science to give their thoughts on going forward. Yes.
Thank you so much. Initially, I would like to, in the name of the Brazilian Academy of Science, as a member of the Troika, to congratulate the Academy of Science of South Africa for such a wonderful meeting that we are just starting. And I want to thank Professor Majosi, Professor Sudiali, as well as Professor Burton for their welcome and for all the work they have done. And I salute also Dr. Vogan Tureken, who is going to be the host for the S20 2026. And briefly, what I would like to mention is that the recommendations that we had in the meeting in Brazil, when the G20 member states get together, they include several of our recommendations. But I think we need to really go beyond that and follow how much of what's written is being indeed happening. And I want to salute also South Africa for putting the topic of climate change and well-being, especially with the recent movements all over the globe that we are living since 2024. It's just the beginning of 2025, but lots of things are changing, and we need to pay attention to that, especially with this incredible topic, climate change and well-being. Why do we need to have policy advisors for climate change if we do have IPCC going on? What is different that we can do in terms of that? I think we should really try to bring our best. And for South Africa, the government, I think the topic fostering solidarity, equity, and sustainable development is fantastic. And in the name of the Minister of Science, Technology and Innovation, I salute all the African people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I think we very much appreciate the recommendations. To move to the present president, may I invite Professor Thokozani Majosi to speak.
Thanks, Prof. Gladhill, and thanks, Prof. Helena Nader, for those words. On my side, really, just a comment or two on what is expected in the next few days. It is very, very important that in whatever we deliberate, we keep in mind that in the ultimate analysis, the people who are supposed to adopt and implement our recommendations are people who might not be scientists like the scientists that we have around this room. The ability to articulate or communicate that message is not a trivial task. Scientists always take it as trivial that because we talk to people who understand our language, we are our community, then those outside our community would also understand. Our task in the final analysis is how do we communicate this in a way that our G20 political leaders would understand and find it proper to adopt and ultimately implement this globally. For me, that would be the ultimate yardstick or the determinant of whether we've succeeded or not. The other issue is we should be very, very careful. It's very easy for us to, or maybe not challenging a task, for us to come up with so-called recommendations, whether they are articulated in scientific format or whatever format, and only to find that those recommendations are not practicable. There are just a few necessary conditions that perhaps our recommendations ought to meet. One of them is, of course, being practicable or actionable. Let's just make sure that whatever we come up with can be actionable. Let us try to ensure that whatever we come up with is measurable. We should be able to say when we meet next year, how far have we gone? We haven't even done that, by the way, with whatever we agreed on in Brazil, to say how far have we gone with what we agreed on in Brazil. It's important that our recommendations are measurable. I'll reiterate what I heard from our colleagues from Saudi Arabia this morning, that they must also be adaptable, because those recommendations will not be universal in most instances. You'd find that there will be conditions on the ground that might necessitate that we adapt accordingly. So I would reiterate that. So, and above all, they must be ambitious. We should be ambitious enough to say this is the way forward if we really want to make a change in the ultimate analysis. So those are the two observations that I would like to make going forward. I hope that in our deliberations we are going to accentuate those two observations. I'm aware that I have only 3 minutes. I'll stop here. Prof. Gretchen.
Thank you very much indeed. As we move to the future, may I invite Dr. Lauren Alexander Augustine from the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America to make some remarks.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to turn this to Von Tarikian, who will give these opening remarks for the United States.
Thank you, Chair, and dear colleagues. It is really a pleasure to be here with you all this week in Pretoria. I would like to particularly recognize the hospitality that our hosts from ASSAf have shown. I sense in the room that many of us are still kind of moving back and forth with the drum beats in our hand, and every now and then kind of going like this. But I think that was a really inspirational way to do two things. One was to get a lot of energy out, but also to build a lot of harmony and unity in our drum beating. And so that was absolutely wonderful. Our academies, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and ASSAf, have a long history of working together. And we look forward to continuing and broadening this cooperation this week and actually well into the future, not only through our S20 and this S20 process, but in other domains as well. I also do want to recognize my dear friend for many years, Dr. Nader, and the Brazilian Academy, ABC, and the work that they did, as I think we all are talking about earlier today, in really setting a very important path forward in your S20 last year in 2024. As the future chair of this forum, we at the National Academy of Sciences have much to learn from our colleagues in South Africa and Brazil. I think we've already had some initial conversations with our colleagues here at the S20, but I think this ongoing learning process about what is still a new forum is important. I mean, this is the S7 is a relatively old forum, and this one is a relatively new forum. And so, any of those of you that have children know that 8-year-olds can be quite temperamental. Yeah. And as one that is there, we have that to look forward to. At the National Academy of Sciences, we really do appreciate the preparation work that ASSAf has done for this meeting, especially circulating the comprehensive think piece. It provides a valuable starting point for our work over the next days and coming months in advance of the G20 handover. As we move forward to September, we will need to work together to try to find common ground for statements or a communiqué, depending on what we decide to call it. We believe this document should be developed based on three broad-based principles. First, it should have a format and a length that is most digestible for our policymaking and government officials. I think, Professor, you alluded to the fact that much of what we're going to be producing is actually from scientists, but not for scientists. And I think that making it digestible will be critical in that pace. Second, it should be technically sound, using evidence and citations, drawing on the best available research to make its case. Third, it should focus on the science and articulate the ranges and gaps of our knowledge in the different areas, rather than trying to articulate policy paths. We should aim to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. I'll conclude by highlighting that this will be a complex endeavor. Our work is being done in the context of diverse and rapidly evolving national circumstances and policies. We thus have a shared burden of producing an evidence-based document that is most useful to the many distinct voices within our official G20 process. We look forward to this conversation over this week and working with our colleagues. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now we are truly moving towards beginnings, and I'd like to introduce Professor Nithya Chetty, a member of council from the South African Academy of Science and Vice President of the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, IUPAP, as well as Chair of the IUPAP Working Group on Physics for Climate Change and Sustainable Development. He has coordinated a group of South African experts in drawing up a preliminary, and I stress preliminary, document purely to start the engagement. I am tempted to say ignite the conversation, like Professor Majosi. I think it's already alight. We're in this together. Over to you, Professor Chetty.
Thank you very much, Professor Gledhill. Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to Pretoria. It was really a delight for me to coordinate a discussion amongst experts within the South African context that developed the paper that we've shared with you. It is a preliminary document and only initially involved South African inputs, but of course now very open to S20 discussions and deliberations. I just wish to point out to a statement that the Minister made a moment ago, and that our work has been developed with the backdrop of developing world priorities as an important consideration. And indeed, this is really, now that the paper has been officially adopted by the Academy Council and members have participated in the development, it is now very much open to inputs from S20. So, colleagues, the style of the paper that you would have looked at is really not in an academic style. It's not meant to be a paper that's meant to be submitted to a journal for publication. It is written in a style that is hopefully readable to a scientifically literate readership.
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little bit? We can't hear from here.
Yeah, apologies. I'll go more down. That's hopefully better. Pardon me. The paper is written in a style that is not necessarily publishable in a scientific journal, but certainly a paper that is hopefully readable to scientifically literate readership, and of course, importantly, readable to our policymakers. Now, the primary purpose for this paper was really to establish a common general baseline understanding of the key issues that are at play here. And And of course, we hope then that through these deliberations and in the coming months, that we will be able to iterate to a paper that can truly be the voice for S20. Now, the style of the paper, if you go through this very quickly, it's written along the lines of what is climate change, what is the impact, especially on well-being, because that's a central theme here. How do we mitigate and adapt to climate change to improve well-being? And of course, in the last part of the paper, you will see that we outline a number of stakeholders, important stakeholders, and we're suggestive as to what those stakeholders could be doing without being overly prescriptive. That is very key aspect of the paper. As S20 ourselves, I think that we should focus our attention primarily on what we as a group of academies can be doing together, jointly, to make a meaningful contribution to this broad conversation. Noting then that there will be a communiqué that will be jointly developed later on this year, and so the inputs from this paper can be an important basis for drawing up those recommendations. So I want to state, and of course it's well known, that an awful lot has happened, has occurred in this domain over the past, say, 15 years or so, involving research institutions, many international organizations, and so on, NGOs, governments. From my perspective, I think that we need to, as S20, really ask ourselves what is it that we can uniquely contribute to this discussion that is not already covered elsewhere. That's a crux for me, and that is how I think that we can make a meaningful contribution to this discussion. And it does then narrow down our actionable plans and helps us hopefully be a lot more focused in the recommendations that we propose. So those would be inward-looking recommendations. What do we as S20, what are we in a position to uniquely contribute to this conversation without necessarily duplicating the efforts of other organizations? Of course, there are outward-looking recommendations. It's the sort of things that we'd like other stakeholders, government included, to take seriously. But here I stress, and this is the position that we've all taken in this field, is not to be overly prescriptive. We can be suggestive and talk to what this evidence suggests, but not necessarily to force that issue. There are many different voices in this conversation from many different walks of life, many different disciplinary backgrounds, but the group of academies has a very special role to play, and that is to stick fastidiously with evidence-based statements. So I would say then that if we can stay within this approach, we will be able to keep this broad church of different voices intact as we advance these conversations forward. And I like the idea that was mentioned earlier this morning, that we've got to build on the successes of previous S20 engagements to continue into the future. That is extremely important, that we act on the recommendations. Now, colleagues, I stated then that I did coordinate the writing of the paper. I did engage with many different expert viewpoints from around South Africa, and it was a delight for me to do that. But there's one institute that I'm particularly grateful for. It's the Global Change Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand that has been very instrumental in assisting and guiding the process. And so then it is my pleasure to call upon Professor Francois Engelbrecht, who's the director of the Global Change Institute, who himself is an expert in this field, to present the preliminary document. Thank you, Francois.
Good morning, colleagues. From my side, welcome to Pretoria, the city where I grew up. It's a great privilege to address members of the S20 academies this morning. This This paper that I guess many of you have read has been a collaborative effort amongst many environmental and climate change experts in South Africa over the last few months. We hope it is a useful input to the documentation sets you are to generate and create over the next few months as the S20. It's certainly a preliminary document, and I'm also sharing with you this morning, of course, my interpretation of it. I'm a traditional climate scientist. I've worked in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for many years. And of course, when I personally will speak about climate change and well-being this morning, it's also my interpretation as someone who is living and working in Africa. Across the 20 academies, there will certainly be a richness of additional ideas to add to this documentation set over the next few months. But let me jump into the talk. I think when we reflect on climate change and well-being this week, we have to, of course, take note of the fact that the era of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming is dawning. So I'm sure everybody in the room knows that last year was the first calendar year to exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius level of global warming. This graph shows a surprisingly warm period, even for IPCC scientists, between July 2023 and June 2024, when the level of global warming was in fact 1.64 degrees Celsius. For that 12-month period. Now, the Paris Agreement on climate change always had as its long-term goal to restrict global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the reason for that is simply because a 1.5 degrees Celsius world is a more dangerous world that will increasingly impact on our well-being and the well-being of the planet. Now, still, as we meet here today, the nations of the world still have choices to make that will determine the level of global warming into the future. Let me start by stating some of the bad news. When the IPCC in 2021 published that graph showing different carbon dioxide emission pathways into the future, they already made the assessment that even if we follow the light blue line, which was the Paris Agreement type pathway, that achieves emission reductions in the order of 45% by 2030, and then achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Even with that pathway, the IPCC said it's more likely than not that the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold will still be exceeded permanently, and that the first year during which it will be exceeded will probably be in the mid-2020s. That last part of the projection already became true. I think if climate scientists should make that assessment today, given the current level of global warming and the unfortunate reality that we did not see drastic emission cuts since 2021, I think most climate scientists today would say it's now likely that the permanent exceedance of 1.5 degrees Celsius is upon us. The estimates that you'll see in the literature at the moment is for the permanent exceedance to happen in the early 2030s or maybe even the late 2020s. So that is the bad news. We are committed to a warmer world. We are likely committed to a 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer world permanently. Now, the good news is, if one thinks in the context of avoiding impacts, that there's still a very good chance, if mitigation is strong in the coming years, to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And the IPCC stated very clearly that every 0.1 degrees Celsius of global warming is important to avoid further impacts. The other alternative is, of course, the red lines, which are the typical fossil fuel type futures, where fossil fuels remain an important mix of the global energy generation until the end of the century. And those are really steering the world towards 3 to 4 degrees Celsius of global warming by the end of the century. So in this draft paper, you'll find this background coming from the physical science base. And then from these scenarios of future greenhouse gas emissions, we talk a bit in the paper, of course, in terms of how we generate these projections of future climate change, which is such a big part of the science. And I thought I'll just mention for the physicists in the room the really important award that effectively went to climate modeling in 2021, nothing less than the Nobel Prize in Physics, awarded to Professors Manavi and Hazelman for their pioneering work building the world's first global climate models and generating the first projections of future climate change. So it is wonderful, I think, that climate modeling has been recognized in this way, and in the year 2021 that the IPCC published the assessment report. So what I'm trying to say with this is that the science of future climate change is strongly rooted in the laws of physics. And increasingly we have confidence in the projections that climate models generate to give us an idea of the risks we will have to face in the future. Now, let us look at a few projections coming from these models towards informing our discussion on well-being and climate change this morning. I would firstly point out that the first thing that these climate models do is they project the level of global warming into the future. And as I've mentioned, with strong mitigation, we can still keep global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius if we look at those light blue and dark blue lines. But we can probably no longer avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. And we will not get back to below that level unless we invent some technology that doesn't exist today, something that can remove some of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So we have to adapt. That's the first message coming from the climate models. We are committed to further warming. This dangerous world is dawning. We have to adapt to the impacts of climate change in that warmer world. And just 2 more slides before we start to talk about well-being, 2 more background slides. There's a wealth of information available that informs us on climate change risks at a regional level. In this last IPCC assessment report, there are specialized chapters looking at climate change for the different regions of the world. Here we can just have a look at that top graph on the left-hand side. That shows us how regional warming will look like when we reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius level permanently, the world that is now dawning. And of course, I think as many of you will know, the Arctic regions of the world are warming faster than anywhere else because of positive feedback processes around the sea ice. But maybe since you are in Pretoria today, it's interesting to note that in the southern hemisphere, there's no place that is warming faster than Botswana, just a few hundred kilometers to the north. And that is because of the very unique climate system of subtropical Africa. So the message here is that different regions in the world will also experience different types of risks. If we look at rainfall patterns, for example, most of the high latitude land masses in the northern hemisphere are projected to become warmer and wetter, and that brings a certain range of risks. Here in subtropical southern Africa and in Mediterranean North Africa and in Mediterranean Europe, it's a completely different change. Here, these regions are projected to become much warmer and drier. And when a water-stressed region like this country becomes drier and warmer, there are very few that one can do in terms of adaptation. So there are also limits to adaptation that will greatly impact on our well-being as we move into this warmer world. Now, let me talk about climate change impacts and well-being from an African perspective and even a Southern African perspective. During this first year that we experienced the warmest year on record, we also experienced a historical drought in Southern Africa. So the summer of 2023 and 24, that December to February period, brought unprecedented heat waves to the region. And it was accompanied by the driest late summer on record in Botswana and Namibia. Now, the net result was devastating. We lost 70% of the maize crop in Zimbabwe and Zambia. The World Food Programme estimated that 30 million people in Southern Africa were in the need of food aid. It's only changing now at the end of a good rainy season, by the way. In Malawi alone, 25% of people needed food aid during this drought. Huge impacts on biodiversity and the environment. And that second photograph there shows hippopotamus stuck in the mud in a channel that dried up in the Okavango Delta. And maybe you remember that it was widely reported in the news that Namibia and Zimbabwe decided to cull wild animals to provide food for vulnerable communities at the height of this drought. In Zambia, the biggest man-made lake in the world, Lake Kariba, was at some point at less than 5% of its capacity. And there were huge impacts in the Zambian economy because of the hydroelectricity generation that came to a standstill. So the evidence that the IPCC accumulated in its working group report 2 of how severe the impacts of climate change already are and increasingly will be in the 1.5 degrees Celsius is overwhelming. And this specific drought was made worse by climate change in terms of the intensity of the heat waves and the intensity of the drought. And the second example I want to share of the immense impact of climate change that we can already see on people, I think, in all our countries, is another example from South Africa. Here we can see our President Ramaphosa, visiting a community that was affected by the biggest flood disaster in the history of South Africa. He was there on the 13th of April 2022. The flood took place over the previous 2 days. 544 people lost their lives in this flood. The economic damages at the time was estimated to be in the order of $3.5 billion US. But just look at that photograph and just think about how people, a few hundred families in South Africa lost loved ones in that flood. And also in this case, there are now published attribution studies that show that climate change made this flood at least 20% worse than it was supposed to be. So climate change is increasingly going to impact across many sectors of the economy, directly affecting people and directly affect the environment. I think that the evidence for that is really overwhelming as we meet this week. So how do we respond? The first thing I'd like to mention is, of course, the Paris Agreement on climate change. Now, almost 10 years since it has been adopted by no less than 196 countries. As colleagues from academies of 20 countries in the G20, let us just reflect again as scientists on what an amazing accomplishment that agreement was. Because 196 countries agreed to accept the science of climate change. And 196 countries agreed to try and avoid these dangerous levels of global warming being reached. So that in itself was an amazing accomplishment. But 10 years later, I think most scientists and most policymakers working on climate would also agree that there has been a lack of action. And now 10 years later, we are on the verge of exceeding the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. So given the lack of climate action that can prevent these dangerous levels of global warming being reached, what should we do? Now, of course, there are many that are losing hope, and they are choosing the route of activism. Then on the left-hand side, we have a protester protesting around the lack of climate funding at the end of COP29, although progress certainly was made. There on the right-hand side is a photograph from students of my university, Witwatersrand, surrounding the offices of Sasol, the biggest fossil fuel company in the country. Just want to mention to Prof. Chetty, the Dean of Science, that I had nothing to do with what the students did on that day. But that is, of course, often the youth that is becoming frustrated with the lack of action in terms of avoiding this dangerous world dawning. So activism is certainly one route that people are choosing. What I think we've already heard this morning from more than one presenter, that in science we still follow the route that has also been the IPCC success, namely to be policy relevant but not prescriptive, and to try within that framework influence policy. Now, in this paper, we identify several sectors and stakeholders that we think are important for science to increasingly engage with as we try to renew climate action. And the sections in the paper that you'll find cover the larger fields of mitigation, adaptation, also loss and damage, of course energy, education and research, so important to all of us, engaging government, finance, the industry, civil society, and of course communication. So in this paper there's a whole rich set of areas where we've tried our best as South Africans to generate some ideas of who the main role players are towards climate action and what our role of scientists should be in try and influencing their decisions. I want to share one specific perspective of how we may want to move forward in this respect. I think this is also the second last slide. Here where we are today in Pretoria and the larger Tshwane region and in Johannesburg to the south, there's currently a huge water crisis. But it is not caused by a lack of water. The big dams in the east are more than 80% full. It's a crisis that exists because of infrastructure and governance issues. I won't go into the detail today. But that's the first point I want to make. If we want to talk to the water managers in South African government or in the city of Johannesburg as scientists about future unprecedented droughts that will bring another drought risk to this part of the world, we firstly have to be very respectful of the fact that in different sectors and in different governments, whether local or national, there's often a myriad of different issues and problems the policymakers and decision makers need to deal with. And we need to have the right approach for them to also consider climate change as an important risk. So if one wants to achieve climate action, one has to build trust. And that's maybe the first message that I think we would like to share from the paper to the broader group of academies. I think the academies are the key entities in terms of building trust in climate science or maintaining trust in climate science in their countries. Then, of course, work with policymakers and provide all the evidence, but do not become policy prescriptive. The moment we do that, however tempting it may be, you are seen as having a specific agenda. So what should be followed, and I think that is what the social scientists working on climate change action have taught us over the last 10 years, is a co-production approach. It's about building trust about the entity you want to influence, develop a shared understanding of the specific climate change risk, and then jointly work towards the solutions. I think what we need to do if we want to stand a chance of reactivating climate action is for us to increasingly work in the solution space. Not only point out the risks, but increasingly work with those who have the decision-making power towards solutions, whether those are solutions in mitigating climate change or adapting to climate change. So this is the last slide. It's an amazing picture. The IPCC used this slogan when they released the report on 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming in 2018. And in that report, they listed all the risks associated with a 1.5 degrees Celsius world. But we were worried at the time that the news media would focus on the risks. So the IPCC tried to frame the messaging as reasons for hope, in the sense that they said, we never have to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. Right? And of course, the messaging failed. The media just reported on basically end of the world is coming. That was the message from the media on the day. Right? But it was still a noble attempt to look at climate change risks from a positive perspective. And that's also where I want to leave it today. I think we as the Academy members, or you as the Academy members and us as the scientists, we have a responsibility to also try and give solutions and hope when it comes to the climate change risks that are dawning upon us in this warmer world. So there are 4 key messages. The first one is 1.5 degrees Celsius is upon us, but climate change mitigation is still able, we have all the technologies to prevent the 2 degrees Celsius level from being reached, avoiding a whole range of additional impacts. It can still be done. The second message is climate science gives us an idea of what the main risks are, a reliable view of the future through these projections. The unprecedented events of the next 10 years should not be unexpected. There's no reason why they should be unexpected. We have the science to project the risks. We have to adapt in time, where it's possible to adapt. And finally, I think, generally across the world, it remains my experience that many governments, whether national or local, the business sector, the private sector, there are so many entities that are engaging with climate science, that want to know the science because they want to adapt and prepare. That's positive. That's also true in South Africa. And finally, the academies, I think, can really make a decision to be very proactive in terms of engaging their governments, business, and, of course, society in their countries, to share with them and to build an interface between climate science and its uptake in decision-making and policy. And there, I think, if the academies approach their governments through the lens of looking for solutions, they may well have ears to listen to. Thank you, colleagues. That's the message from ASSAf for today. Thank you.
So, colleagues, I believe that this is where the real work begins. The next steps start. And I believe that this is where the co-creation of this group from the present into the future with our current knowledge begins. So thank you very much for your attention. And I think this will open up from here on. Now, I know that climate change won't wait around, but may I beg for a few minutes of the time of the leading representatives of the 20 academies to have a photograph taken. Those with flags will find that they have a little indicator of where they should be on the stage here. I've always wondered how this was done, and now I know. So please, would the leaders come up and take part in the photograph? Thank you.
Their names. You're very good at that.
Yep, Germany next to France.
Nee, Germany ist schon zweimal da.
Sorry.
There's the name. They have the names of the countries. There's one China. Ja, da haben wir das Ding, kann man das wegmachen? Australia.
No hitting me on the head.
Unfortunately, a victim of climate change. It's not good. So maybe
So where does I can't find you from Australia?
Can we take that down? Probably
Can you
not,
take
huh?
that down, please?
Yeah, it's all linked. Be careful with it. It's all wired.
Yeah, it's glued to the floor.
No, I couldn't. But I'm just standing.
Just stand next to
Yeah,
Germany
yeah.
if you want.
Yeah.
Please do join us.
Absolutely. Happy to.
It's okay. Relax. It's okay.
stars. I'm gonna give you my heart. 'Cause you're a sky full of stars.